Hello, I'm Chris Williamson, and this is No2Nato. We're going to be discussing NATO's successful regime change operation in Syria this evening with two outstanding guests, Professor Piers Robinson and Richard Medhurst. Piers founded the Working Group on Syria, Propaganda and Media, and is the co-director of the Organisation for Propaganda Studies. Richard was born in Syria, and he's an independent investigative journalist specialising in US politics, international relations and the Middle East. It's no coincidence, that as soon as the ceasefire with Hezbollah was announced last month, the regime change operation in Syria began on several different fronts. The corporate media refers to the militias who mounted the offensive as Syrian rebels, but many of them have no connection whatsoever to Syria. And Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, is made up of former ISIS and al-Qaeda fighters. Joe Biden's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan's on record saying that al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. Well, the United States has spent millions of dollars arming these al-Qaeda and ISIS-linked militants in order to effect a regime change operation against Bashar al-Assad. The Kurdish Syrian Democratic Forces, often referred to by its acronym SDF, is another faction that's participated in the regime change operation. The SDF has also been bankrolled by the United States for years and was used by the US to steal Syrian oil after occupying Syria's oil fields, with America's help, of course. Then there's the misnamed Syrian National Army, made up of militias who've been directly supported by the United States. They also participated in the regime change initiative. But we mustn't underestimate the role played by Turkey, another NATO country. They were hugely significant, and Turkey's been given succor to the head-chopping militants for years in Idlib, which is a Syrian province bordering Turkey that Turkey has occupied since 2017. Furthermore, Turkey broke the terms of its agreement with Russia and Iran, which stated that all three countries were committed to the sovereignty, independence, unity and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic as a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, non-sectarian and democratic state. The agreement that was signed by the three countries also expressed their conviction that there's no military solution to the Syrian conflict and that it can only be solved through a political process based on the implementation of the UN Security Council Resolution 2254 in its entirety. Some commentators are suggesting that Turkey could gain from Syria's demise by enhancing its role as an oil distributor with a new pipeline from Syria's oil fields. But I guess the biggest benefactor will be Israel. They've already made further incursions, as I'm sure everybody's seen on the news, into Syria beyond the occupied Golan Heights. There's even been reports that Israeli tanks have been seen on the outskirts of Damascus. Assad's fall also represents a major blow to the struggle for Palestinian liberation. Whatever criticism that may be levelled at Assad's leadership of Syria, he was a key figure in the axis of resistance. He'd been offered huge personal inducements to abandon the Palestinian people on a number of different occasions, but he refused. And the logistical impact on the resistance factions in Palestine and Lebanon, for that matter, can't be overstated. And that's because Syria, under Bashar al-Assad, was the land bridge for crucial supplies of equipment and materials reaching Lebanon and Palestine. But this crucially important fact seems to be lost on a number of Palestine solidarity activists who've been actually celebrating the fall of Bashar al-Assad. So at this point, let me bring in Professor Piers Robinson now as our first guest speaker this evening to give us his perspective on the tumultuous events that have taken place in Syria over the last couple of weeks. Good evening, Piers. How are you, mate?
Hi, Chris. I'm well. Well, we have 2024, the overthrow of yet another government. And there's a feeling of Groundhog Day, really. We've been here before, Libya 2011, Iraq 2003, Afghanistan. This is clearly another success, ultimately, for the Western war machine, for the military-industrial complex, for the Western Empire. Of course, the way it's being presented in the mainstream media is that it's being celebrated as a liberation, absurdly, as you pointed out in your introduction, that Jelani, the guy who's effectively has control of the country, is linkable to al-Nusra, al-Qaeda, etc. These are extremist groups who have been given power. But that's where we are. And in some ways, I think that I'm hoping that however disastrous this outcome is and will probably become for the people in Syria, the only sort of positive, or not really positive, but the only useful thing out of this is potential just to waken up more people in the West as to what is going on in the international system and what our governments are doing. As I said, this is one of a number of regime, in inverted commas, change wars which have been fought since 9/11. Syria has been a particularly bloody and vicious one. It's 2011 this started. You mentioned some of the involvement and the backing of various extremist groups. Operation Timber Sycamore was the joint CIA-Saudi operation, a huge operation in terms of money being funneled into basically supporting extremist groups in Syria to try and overthrow the Syrian government, with an ugly trail of human rights abuses, head choppings, etc. going on. So this has been a dirty war, as I think Max Blumenthal describes in his book. This is a dirty war in order to overthrow the Syrian government. And, for publics in the UK, I think a lot of the time people have sort of not been very conscious of how involved Britain has been in this regime change operation. And the fact of the matter is, going back to 2011, you see the emergence of a major propaganda operation funded through the Conflict Security and Stability Fund, money going into these cut-out organizations or these outsourced operations such as ARC, Incostrat, the White Helmets, CEJA as well, the Centre for International Justice and Accountability. And these effectively outsourced propaganda operations have been very effective in building a narrative, a perception amongst the British public that has essentially demonized the Syrian government, promoted the sort of claim that he was using chemical weapons against his population, whitewashed the groups that we were backing, and the White Helmets played a key role in that. And also providing, as we found out with the Incostrat outsourced company in 2016, providing PR to groups such as Jaish al-Islam. And this has been an immense operation. And the research I've done and the work I've done with colleagues such as David Miller and others in the working group for Syria Propaganda and Media, we were very conscious of the sort of tender documents being handed out early on. And how you effectively had these sort of former British military people who would sort of go into and take over these companies. So you had Paul Tilley running Incostrat, you had James LeMessurier, of course, becoming involved in the White Helmets and setting up that organization. So it's propaganda by remote, that we've had in the case of Syria from a British context. And what it's basically done is deceived the British public. It's made the British public think that Assad is all bad. He uses chemical weapons against his population. And so that we get to the point where we are now, where the British public can be sold the image of Jelani, an extremist, being handed power in Syria as the country is literally divided between Turkey, Israel, and also obviously the US still have troops in northeast Syria. And it's seen as a good thing. It's seen as a positive thing. And it's a very perverse sort of impression which is being created. But that's what has been achieved through these propaganda campaigns that we've seen. In the final thing I'll say on this is that it should be getting pretty obvious to people by now. You and I have lived through 20 years plus of major conflicts in the international system, and we lived through 2003, Iraq, and we've lived through Libya. We've seen all the destruction. We've seen all of the mainstream media celebrating when these governments fall, and then we've seen the disastrous aftermath, and then we've seen the outcome of, for example, the weapons of mass destruction search in Iraq. Well, there weren't any because it was a deception. And so I think all of that is, at least in that there's a possibility for people to become aware of what's going on. This is a war machine. It's a war machine which started with 9/11. And, for anyone who takes the time to look carefully at 9/11, they'll understand fairly quickly that the official story on 9/11 is false. It's untrue. and then the allegation of Al-Qaeda attacking us. And well, here we are now in 2024, and we're giving Al-Qaeda effectively control of Syria. That should get people to think a little bit more carefully. So I think, the deception and the propaganda and the reality of what we've seen and the horrendous destructiveness across all of these countries, I forgot to mention Afghanistan, is this a point at which we can, No2Nato can actually get more of the Western public to realize our governments are engaged systematically in attacking other countries, all completely illegal under international law, violates all of our sort of proclaimed norms internally. We're supporting extremist groups, and you look at any of the workers, like, for example, Ava Bartlett or Vanessa Beeley in Syria, and you see this litany of violence coming from these extremist groups, horrendous, horrific violence. And, that's what we're doing. That's what our governments are doing. So before we attack Iran, and I'd say we're heading in that direction, I think we need to work very, very hard now to try and wake up as many people as possible as to what's been going on, however demoralized everybody's feeling at the moment. Because I know people are feeling demoralized at what has just happened.
Absolutely. I mean, and you mentioned Max Blumenthal there in your first response, Piers, and he's written an excellent book called The Management of Savagery. And I think what a lot of people in the British public will be surprised to learn is Britain's role, the United States' role in actually facilitating the savagery that we are seeing now. I mean, you've touched on this point just at the end of your last contribution about Al Qaeda, the devil incarnate, the main enemy, and now here we are, funding them. And as I was saying, Jake Sullivan saying, well, Al Qaeda's on our side in Syria. Just say a word or two, Willie, because I know you obviously part of your thing is you kind of study sort of propaganda. Just tell us really about this management of savagery. And you might want to I think you mentioned the white helmets. I mean, the fact that they're actually funded by the British government. I think they had £2 million. I think they just had another £300,000 from the British government very, very recently. Just say a little bit more, will you, if you could, Piers, about this whole, as I've said, management of savagery and the role that the British government has actually played in what's happening here in Syria now.
Well, essentially, I mean, of course, any kind of student of history will know that British foreign policy has been involved in groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood and has historically supported extremist groups, and so has the United States. Extremist groups are useful proxies for our foreign policy objectives because they're brutal and cruel, and they're able to get the job done. And and we've seen this on steroids in the case of the Syrian conflict. So the fact is, we back these extremist groups, we arm them, etc. And then, of course, it becomes essential to sell this to Western publics, because Western publics, and our liberal friends in liberal bubbles and the people who read The Guardian, watch the BBC, they think, well, we're not people who do that kind of thing. We are on the side of right and democracy and tolerance, etc. So you've got to sell this, you've got to package these extremists to your publics, and you do that through propaganda. You do that, for example, through organizations such as the White Helmets, which you had set up in order to essentially give a very sort of particular interpretation of what was going on in the conflict. And of course, as you know from my own work, we know full well that the White Helmets have been very closely involved in the supplying of information regarding alleged chemical weapons attacks, and that being fed up into the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and that has been manipulated information. And of course, in the work I've done a lot on the alleged Duma attack, where OPCW scientists themselves came out and effectively blew the whistle on the manipulation of that investigation to point the finger at the Syrian government. White Helmets were heavily involved in that. So you have these groups which are sort of involved in a combined sort of sugarcoating the opposition groups and trying to gloss over the fact that these are extremist groups. White Helmets groups there just to save people's lives. And then they're involved in also feeding up and constructing this wider narrative that the Syrian government is a user of prohibited weapons and so on. And this is all absolutely essential because, I mean, this is a point that some realists make about foreign policy, that Western liberal democracies, when they engage in their foreign policy and they're doing the ugly things which their foreign policy communities think needs to be done, are fully aware that the publics will not accept this. So they have to be lied to, or they have to be propagandized into consenting, their consent manufactured to support the policy. And it's an essential part of it, of basically maintaining these wars. It's a deception. I would add to the point you were making, and I think, as much as we're focused on Syria at the moment, propaganda also involves misdirection. And at the moment, I get the sense that, obviously there's a geostrategic reality and shifting in the distribution of power in the Middle East because of what we're seeing going on at the moment. But at the same time, it's very advantageous to Israel and it's very advantageous to the West for the attention to be pulled off what's happening in Gaza and in Lebanon. We have, this is the other extraordinary thing, and this goes back to this point about trying to wake people up. We know we're 23 years into the global war on terror post 9/11, etc., and we're having a genocide. We have a demonstrable genocide against the Palestinians being conducted, and I think sort of the glee with which the chattering classes and the mainstream media are pushing the attention onto Syria, pumping out the propaganda as hard as they can to whitewash Jelani and so on. This is useful because it pulls people's attention away from the ongoing genocide. And, could you or I have ever imagined we'd be at this point in 2024? Perhaps we saw it coming. I think when I was teaching at Manchester University and I was sort of tentatively going through the UN maps on the occupied territory saying, this looks like a land grab. Look, all this territory is going over time and so on. But did we ever think it would get to this point where we see the level of destruction that we do in Gaza? So there's this is one of the problems we face with educating the public is that there's the propaganda, there's all the propaganda surrounding Syria, but also, these are powerful actors we're up against. They have huge resources, and some of their calculations on this are right. Let's get people focusing in on Syria. And I suspect, and I'm speculating here, but I suspect, from the point of view of Western foreign policy objectives or the politics of the empire, quite happy to see extremism and chaos starting to emerge in Syria and keep the attention off what's going on in Gaza. That's strategically very, very useful, as well as the kind of the general weakening, the collapse of the Syrian state into sort of a warlordism. This is something which I would not be surprised if that was desired in the Western power centers, because this is the playbook, right? You break a state and then you dismantle it. And, if it's broken up and you've got groups fighting, then it's easier to control. You see it in the DRC in that conflict over the last 20 years. And there's many other examples of that. So the kind of sort of scorched earth caused chaos is functional and useful to Western governments. And, without going on too long, of course, this in a way was always the objective, right? If you go back to the Project for New American Century in the 90s, breaking the big states in the Middle East, breaking Iraq, breaking Syria, Iran was always last on the list. And, that's where we're at, unfortunately.
Indeed. And just another word on propaganda, if I may, Piers. I mean, the propaganda is very insidious, isn't it? It's not just simply the corporate media outlets that are engaged in this propaganda exercise. It's kind of Hollywood. It's the whole arts sector as well, isn't it? Just say a little bit about that, because I think that doesn't it, in my opinion, help to shape opinion. Perhaps in a more subtle way, but it's very powerful as well, isn't it?
I think propaganda is ubiquitous, and so you have to kind of, as you described, the sort of the formal or the usual, so what people understand as propaganda, government briefers pumping information out and so on. But the manipulation of information and the funding and the resources and so on. This penetrates all sectors of our society. I think if you look at academia, you can see effectively the production of manipulated information and so on through funding streams. So academia ends up playing a propaganda role. You see it the same in the arts, in popular entertainment. Your point about Hollywood is well taken. I mean, Matt Alford and Tom Secker's book on Hollywood and the comfortable relationship between the Pentagon and Hollywood and so on in terms of scripts, etc. This is very, very pervasive. Propaganda in Western societies is very deep in the sense that it penetrates right down into the education system and so on. And it's also it's stretched in terms of how far ahead I think elite groups are thinking is quite extensive. That there is long-term planning about shaping public opinion, moving the public towards accepting. And at the moment, as we see in the chatter coming from our political classes and from NATO, you can see this discourse of moving people towards acceptance of the idea of war and conflict. Yeah. And you can see this feeding and it bleeds into our media, it bleeds into Netflix and so on. And, I suspect that we are, and it's a depressing thought, but we need to be alert to it. But that's exactly what's happening. We are being shifted towards a position of being on a war footing. I mean, obviously, we're literally in direct conflict with Russia now over the Ukraine. We know what's happening in the Middle East, and and that's why I'm happy with No2Nato being around. I mean, I used to go and give talks at NATO. Back in the days when they used to invite me. But this is a war machine, and it's dangerous, for us and the populations, and we need to find ways of solidifying our resistance to it and to stopping it, because I think they are pushing us towards that point where at some point, I don't think it's going to be a kind of a traditional war, but it's going to be a situation where we are in direct conflict in some shape or form, and our sons and daughters are going to end up being in those conflicts.
Exactly. I mean, we might have time to get into that a little bit more towards the end of the program. But just before I bring in Richard, I wonder whether you might just say a little word or two about your response to those in the liberal left and some in the Muslim community who have been celebrating the fall of Bashar al-Assad, and for those of us that have raised concerns about what's happened, being labelled as Assadists. You're an Assadist if you are raising questions and are expressing concerns about the implications of this geopolitically.
Well, one propaganda strategy is to divide communities and divide resistance communities, and I suspect that's what's been going on in this case, where you see this division, for example, in the Palestinian movement and so on, with those supporting the overthrow of the Syrian government and those who are not. I mean, I bluntly, it's naive. There is no indication that what is being put in place now in Syria is going to do anything but cause much greater death and destruction. And I've got a pretty close understanding of the chemical weapons allegations being leveled at the Syrian government, and I've worked with a number of people. I know people within the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. I know full well what's been going on with that. People have been deceived over that. And so given my knowledge about that, I'm pretty open to being very neutral on, well, what exactly was the Syrian government guilty of? Because we have a huge propaganda campaign to demonize it. Okay, so I think it's naive for people to be buying all the propaganda. I think there are other people who are probably just deliberately, sort of for strategic purposes, sort of going against the Assad government and so on. But without getting into that, but the face of it, it's naive. We've been here before. We've seen it with Iraq. We've seen it with Afghanistan. We've seen it with Libya. You demonize these governments because you want to overthrow them, and the demonizing nearly always involves gross exaggeration and so on. So I think that's what we've had. So it's naive, and of course, geostrategically, this has severely weakened the cause of the Palestinians.
Yes.
okay, by the collapse of the Syrian state in the way it's been done. This is it's not the end for the Palestinians. I believe that resistance will continue.
Absolutely,
but it's
made more
clearly
difficult.
it's going to be extremely difficult. So I suspect, do you remember all those people cheering after the fall of Saddam Hussein?
Yeah,
it took a couple of weeks, didn't it? And there was for enough gunfire to be rattling off in Baghdad for people to start to go, wait a minute, this doesn't seem to be going according to plan, etc. So, and we're only within several days from the overthrow of the Syrian government. So that's where this is going to head. And I think the celebration that we're seeing is going to be short-lived. History indicates that, and also just a reading of what we're seeing already in Syria. This is, on a sort of from a personal opinion point of view, this is a disaster for the country, and I'm very sorry for people who I know who are Syrian who feel they have lost their country because of what's happened.
No, indeed. Well, I know somebody who feels like that is Richard Medhurst, who, as I said in the introduction, was born in Syria, so has obviously a personal interest as well as obviously an interest as a journalist. Do we have Richard online now, and can we bring Richard in at this stage? Hi, Richard. Thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening on No2Nato. The floor is yours. Give us your perspective, Richard, on what's happening and how you see the future unfolding. Richard, I think you're muted.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Chris, and thanks to No2Nato for all the work it's doing. We shouldn't forget everything that's going on in Syria has been backed, orchestrated by NATO. Turkey and the United States are NATO armies. So we've had 2 NATO armies occupying Syria for a long time now, and they are, it's not just Israel that's profiting and making moves inside of Syria. We really have to look at the bigger picture, and I find it absolutely incredible how people can talk about Syria without mentioning geopolitics. They want to pretend like it's some kind of planet that is just in space, and there's a dictator and now he's gone and everything is rosy, and that's not how it works. I mean, it's you get the impression these people have never picked up a map in their lives. Syria is the link between Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, and then Palestine. The geographical link, the lifeline, the supply line, and it's never accepted Israel. Israel's been occupying Syria since 1967, Golan Heights. Syria was the last Arab state in the region that actually upheld the Palestinian cause. Right? You've got many non-state actors, but the only state actor was Syria. Jordan, Egypt, Morocco, Saudi Arabia. They were all lost causes at this point. Not the people there, but certainly the governments. And I find it so comical and outrageous at the same time. And I'm sure you've all seen that video from Channel 4 where they're interviewing some random clown who's now apparently a government official about the bombings, and even the Channel 4 journalist is in shock. It's saying, Israel's bombed Syria about 300 times. You're not going to say anything. You don't have an opinion about it. That's who we're dealing with. And these people have allowed Israel to come in and destroy all the military assets. I mean, Syria, put aside the resources and its position for a second. Just Syria had a lot of bright minds, a lot of bright scientists, a lot of young, smart people, and it was self-sufficient in many ways, right? And had free education. In Syria, you'd have, for example, and this is every single year. You walk in the street, and they would put billboards up, posters up, of the students in high school that just graduated with the top marks. You were literally celebrated in the street with your photograph because you excel academically, and you have to in order to get in good positions. Best university in Syria is University of Damascus. It's free. It's run by the government. It's not the private universities. So, you know, there's a lot of competitiveness, and also that mentality means that you have a very bright future of you know, young people that are worth investing in. And now all that research and development, all of that wealth that's been accumulated, I don't mean just material, but also the R&D, the knowledge, and again, under sanctions on top of it, has been flushed down the toilet. You know, these people that have taken power, these head-chopping lunatics, are illegitimate just by virtue of allowing Israel to hollow out Syria's military. You know, I've even seen a video, for example, of them driving around, you know, casually filming some underground military facilities, secret military facilities, and complaining on top of it, saying, "Oh, look at what Bashar al-Assad was spending the people's money on," like as if, you know, Syria isn't at war and hasn't been at war for decades against its own will. You know, they're just giving away military secrets and the locations of military sites to the enemy. Again, Bashar al-Assad is gone. So, you know, these people that are so power hungry that they've plunged the country 50 years backwards, finally got power. And what do they do when Israel is attacking? They do absolutely nothing. And that is treason. By definition, it's treason. So, you know, we're talking about the Navy. The Navy's been absolutely eviscerated in Ladir, in Latakia. You look at the Air Force, this fleet of MiGs, you know, Syria didn't have the latest planes in the world, fighter jets in the world, but it's always been backed by the Soviet Union and by the Russians. It had a lot of good hardware, and what it couldn't buy, it would produce locally. That's all been destroyed. The surface-to-air missiles that defended Syria's skies, and I used to complain. I was one of the people who would complain that, you know, where are the Russians? Every 2 weeks, Israel is coming in and bombing Syria unimpeded, and you know, I would complain. I would say, what's going on? Obviously, a war would start if the Russians get involved, but nevertheless, you know, it's upsetting. But look at the difference. As soon as you take away the army and you take away the deterrence, the Israelis go wild. Look, we've all seen how they're bombing Gaza, but this bombing campaign against Syria is in fact Israel's largest in history, despite what they're doing in Gaza. Can you imagine how large that is? We're talking about 400 plus airstrikes, not to mention the fact that the Americans were also carrying out airstrikes as well. So they've hollowed out Syria's defenses and made sure that anyone who takes power now is going to be impotent, is going to be neutered, ineffective, and they have left the country defenseless. And while they're walking around taking photographs of them, you know, waving flags and eating ice cream, you know, Israel is coming in and bombing the country, and they're doing absolutely nothing about it. And I find this absolutely scandalous. Not to mention the fact that these people who have taken power have blood on their hands. You can't sit there and tell me Jolani doesn't have blood on his hands when, you know, we're talking about someone who used to decapitate people. He was not just in Al-Qaeda, he was also in ISIS. So if Bashar al-Assad's a butcher, you get rid of a butcher and then put in another butcher. I'm really struggling to understand how this is an upgrade for Syria in any capacity. Not to mention the fact that these people were backed by foreign governments. You know, when you have to spend $1 billion to overthrow a foreign president, and you've got Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Britain, America, all these countries coming in, how can you call that revolution? It's regime change, isn't it?
Absolutely. Richard, just say a word or two, will you, as well, about you know, why the United States so interested in Syria? What are they going to gain from this? And indeed, if you could say a word or two, what Turkey's playing at here. I mean, what do they stand to gain? I was saying in the introduction that some commentators have talked about them seeing themselves as a big player in terms of oil distribution and benefiting from a new pipeline from Syria's oil fields and so on. Is that what's driving Turkey's role, or are there other factors going on? Just say a word or two about those two things, really. You know, what the states are playing out and what Turkey's playing out, and why they've done what they've done.
Well, it goes without saying their main objective was to destroy the axis of resistance and remove Syria as that central link that connects Iraq, Iraq to Lebanon and Palestine. So that was the number one objective, right? And that serves Israel, and that serves the United States first and foremost. And of course, I mean, Erdogan, he pretends to care about Palestine, but all he does is talk, right? It's nothing but hot air. What has he done? He's done nothing but deliver oil to the Israelis from Azerbaijan so they can continue bombing Gaza. So, the fuel that's put in those jets and tanks is coming from Baku. Now, what Turkey wants, even though it's also a NATO country, just like, NATO member state, just like the US, even though they both wanted to get rid of Bashar al-Assad, they have slightly different, or very, very slightly different agendas inside of Syria. When it comes to the Kurds, for example, who control 1/3 of the country because the United States are helping them occupy the oil fields and the breadbasket region, Turkey basically wants to persecute Kurds. I can't count the number of times that they've cut off the water supply into Hasakeh and Deir ez-Zor. And of course, that impacts everybody, not to mention the fact that it's wrong. It's, you're basically starving people and depriving them of their basic necessities. So that they attacked all of Syria when they did that. But they specifically want to target the Kurds. They don't want the Kurds to have their own country. Neither do Syrians, of course, because if you give the Kurds the country, I mean, why not start giving, Syrian Armenians their own country, or Syrian Orthodox Christians their own country? Basically, they want to balkanize Syria even further, the imperialist powers. But Turkey, specifically, just in regards to the Kurds, has now surrounded them from the north and through the west now, having taken over Homs, having taken over Damascus, and so on. I don't know for how long the Americans will protect them. I think that the Americans are going to stab the Kurds in the back, just like they did in 2019, just like they've done before. So Turkey's interest is to deindustrialize Syria. We've seen them picking apart factories, bolt by bolt, nut by nut, and taking all that equipment out. They don't want to have a regional competitor in any capacity. Erdogan is Muslim Brotherhood. He wants to expand this delusional idea of the rise of the Ottoman Empire and him being some kind of sultan. So that's where Turkey's coming from. Now the United States, they are in the east, as I was saying before. Turkey's coming from the north, and Israel, they've come in from the south, and they have their project of Greater Israel. So they've succeeded now in destroying the axis of resistance, or basically Syria's central role in it. And they, of course, want to take more land. The finance minister, Smotrich, was just saying on camera a few weeks ago that he wants Israel to extend to Damascus. So these people are absolutely shameless about their expansionist, messianic ambitions. They're a bunch of colonizers and a bunch of thieves. There's no other way to put it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And of course, Turkey, broke that agreement that they'd made with Russia and Iran, the Astana process, to basically, police, if you like, the UN Security Council Resolution 2254. I think it was back in 2015. And I mean, I talked about some of the terms of that in the introduction, Richard. I don't know if you heard that, but one of the things that it said in that agreement was that there can be no solution through military action, as it were. Well, I mean, Turkey's clearly broken that trust, hasn't it? I mean, what do you think the long-term implications are for that, if any, in terms of the way they've kind of double-crossed Russia and Iran?
Sorry, just the last words you said about Russia and Iran.
Well, they've double-crossed Russia and Iran. I mean, they signed up to this agreement. And they've broken the terms of it.
Yeah. I mean, the sad thing is that I think we'd have to be here all night counting the amount of UN Security Council resolutions that have been violated, not just by Turkey, by the way, but by Israel, by the US. 242, 497. It's a very, very, very long list, unfortunately. But I think we have to wait and see what's going to happen between Turkey and Iran, Russia, because it's still not clear what happened. What led to the army not fighting, being ordered to stand down, because many soldiers filmed videos saying they were ordered to stand down. We saw columns and columns of troops just, surrendering. So there was obviously a deal going on here. I think, my hunch is that sit down we saw between Turkey, Iran, and Russia in Doha wasn't, a meeting of old compadres who wanted to have a nice sit down because they all share love for Syria. I think what happened is that it was a lost cause by that point. I don't know if Bashar al-Assad was already in Moscow by that point, but I think they could all see that it was over, and they were basically just hashing out the terms of the agreement that there's not going to be any bloodshed, that Turkey and its the Al-Qaeda groups that it's backing will form a transitional government, and maybe Assad is allowed to get out freely. I really don't know what they actually agreed on in that meeting, and I don't think we will for a very, very long time. But the reverberations this is going to have are going to last for generations. They really are, and it's it's shocking that these rebels, so-called rebels, didn't waste 5 minutes breaking all the promises they made. They said they're going to give amnesty to Syrian soldiers. Now we see them being executed and lynched, beaten in public, just horrific vigilantism and thuggery. They said they're going to protect journalists and protect minorities. And I saw ISIS trucks driving through Damascus neighborhoods, Christian neighborhoods. I saw a Christian Syrian journalist saying that she'd been stopped in the street and harassed and questioned about whether she's an Alawite or a Shia or a Christian or a Druze. I mean, it's unheard of in Syria, and it's really disgusting. And the worst part is that you have foreign entities backing this stuff. It'd be bad enough if this sprung out of Syria itself, but you have a tiny portion of Syrian society that is crazy, just like you do in every single country in the world. And what's happened is the CIA, MI6, Mossad, and Turkish intelligence went and backed those people, and now gave them the keys to the oldest city in the world. And a lot of people are trying to be, to keep their fears at bay, and they're trying to be hopeful. Really, I'm telling you, they're trying to believe that these promises that are being given about electricity coming back and food coming back are true. A lot of Syrians really don't want the country to fall apart. They want unity. They just want it to all finally be over. But these people that have taken power, they're not in the business of forgiveness. They hold grudges, and we saw what they do when they do have power. They chop people's heads off, and they are the scum. They're really the scummiest terrorists that we can possibly imagine. And it's no surprise the CIA, MI6, Mossad got in bed with them, honestly.
We're talking to Piers, obviously before you came on to say your piece, Richard, about propaganda and the role of the political class, and we touched on it a little bit with what you've been saying now as well. I wonder what your thoughts were in relation to the British Foreign Secretary's statement in the House. I don't know if you saw it, when he was commenting on Bashar al-Assad leaving to go to Moscow, referring to him as a rat, scuttling out of the country. I mean, how do you respond to that? And how should we all respond to statements like that from the British Home Secretary, British Foreign Secretary? I beg your pardon.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a, I mean, it's unclassy, to say the least, to put it really mildly. I think it was lost on him, perhaps because he doesn't know basic Arabic. Assad means the lion. It's literally the guy's name. So it's not like, people call him that just because randomly. But, he said that he's not the lion of Damascus, he's the rat of Damascus, and he fled with his tail between his legs. I mean, come on. You're going to sit there and pretend while you're arming Israel to literally bomb Syria, right? And bomb Palestine like you're some kind of angel. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. I think I should remind the viewers that unfortunately our foreign intelligence service, MI6, is structured under the FCDO. So technically speaking, the head of MI6 reports to David Lammy. So I mean, what is he now except the don of an organization of spooks? I mean, obviously we need foreign intelligence gathering and a diplomatic corps, but destroying countries is not in the interest of anyone in Britain except those making money off of it and the Zionists. And then on top of that, gloating and saying that a guy who was re-elected multiple times by his own people and has far more legitimacy than this Labour government or Macron's government or any other government in Europe is a rat. I mean, come on, get out of here, really. The guy could have abandoned ship a long time ago, and he stayed there for 13 years. And I'm not a personal fan. I'm trying to, and I've been trying to explain to people for a long time that you can't take away a faulty car and then replace it with a bicycle and call it a set of wheels. But that's what they've done to Syria. They've downgraded it, and now they're dancing on our graves.
Yeah. What do you think the long-term future, Richard, is for Russia in Syria, its bases? I mean, apparently there are some, guarantees that they're going to be able to remain there. Do you think that is likely, or what's going to be their position, do you think, going forward?
Yeah, so they have a strategic base on the Mediterranean Sea in Syria, in Tartus, in Latakia. This is on the Mediterranean coast. It's about 4 hours drive from Damascus. And, they've had that base since about 1971, 1973. It's been leased to them for several decades. And by the looks of it, despite Russian ships leaving and a lot of personnel being evacuated, by the looks of it, they're going to keep that base. And I'm assuming this is perhaps one of the things that they sat down and agreed on during their talks, that no matter what happens and no matter who takes power, those bases won't be touched. I'm not necessarily saying that means Russia sold Bashar al-Assad. I mean, that doesn't even make sense, because they already had the base, right? So they didn't get anything new. But as a matter of fact, those people who are complaining about Russia trying to expand its sphere of influence inside of Syria and the Middle East, that base was crumbling. It was a shambles around 2011. But because of the war, this dirty war on Syria, it ended up being renovated, upgraded, renewed. It's state of the art now, actually. That's the irony of what the West and its allies did inside of Syria. They actually, in one way, kind of invited or forced Russia in the end to come in and upgrade its presence in Syria. And we should all remember that Russia kind of had to be not begged, but convinced by Iran and Syria to join after they were unwilling to get involved. And Russia's future, I don't think they were going to have much of a role inside of Syria. They're busy with Ukraine, and we shouldn't forget that what's going on in Syria right now is an extension of this war in Ukraine and the genocide in Gaza. It links everything together, and they thought, okay, well, if we go from the side, we flank them, we can wear them down, distract them, and look at what they've done. They've distracted us even from talking about Gaza.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? So it has served their purpose, the imperialist purpose, to a certain degree, and NATO's goals to a large degree. And I think it doesn't mean that all is necessarily lost, but it goes to show you that Iran, Russia, Syria, they were putting up quite a fight. And I really want people to understand that what just happened is not a revolution. Again, when you have dozens of foreign actors working around the clock to get rid of your government, that's regime change. It's not a grassroots homegrown revolution. And now the future for Christian minorities, for other minorities, is looking very, very uncertain. And the harassment that's already taking place, these public executions.
Yes.
We all saw this coming. We saw what NATO did in Libya. We saw what NATO did in Afghanistan and Iraq. It never ends well. And even if it did end well, they had no business being there in the first place. And Syria.
I mean, it's a huge tragedy, isn't it? I mean, just in terms of the Christian community, the oldest Christian community in the world, is potentially going to be destroyed.
It's quite sad, I was baptized in Syria. You should see the monasteries and the churches that are in Syria. A lot of them are still underground, because back then the Romans would persecute Christians, so they would have to pray underground. This is the same place where Christianity spread to Europe. So these people that are sitting in the House and in Congress and want to quote the Bible every second minute so they can justify backing Israel. For some reason, these evangelical U.S. Congress people, they don't seem to mind butchering Christians in Syria and butchering Christians in Iraq. And I'll just remind viewers that after we invaded Iraq with the Americans in 2003, 80% of the Christian population in Iraq disappeared because we allowed people like Jolani, and he was in Iraq, to come to power, to butcher minorities, to persecute Christians. And that is a tragedy. We're not talking about some people who happen to be Christian inside of Muslim countries. These are the original Christians. They're the descendants of the first converts. And that's the same thing in Syria. You've even got places like Ma'lula where they speak Aramaic. They still speak the same language that Jesus spoke. So for people who claim to love the Bible and who claim to be religious, they sure love killing Christians and Christian communities.
Indeed, and Christians being killed in Palestine as well, of course. But someone else who's benefited hugely from this is Benjamin Netanyahu personally, isn't it? I mean, hasn't his position now been consolidated? I mean, I know he's in some difficulty with a court case for corruption looming over his head, but I mean, he's unassailable now, isn't he?
I mean, I can't see this going any other way. I'm sure that most Israelis are looking at this and they're very, very happy. They're very happy that Syria is now basically under Zionist control, that it's not able to defend itself, and the fact that they already had the Golan Heights in '67, but now they've taken even more of it. I mean, you've got Israeli tanks at 19 kilometers from Damascus. That is the legacy of this revolution.
Yes.
Anyone involved with that should hang their heads in bloody shame. How can you allow any foreign army, never mind Israel, that's been starving you, that's been bombing you, that has done everything in its power to help Al-Qaeda inside of Syria, to ravage the country, to invade? And it's not just that, Chris. They've taken over Mount Haramon. This is basically the highest peak in Syria. And it's not just because we like geology here. The point is that it's in the Golan Heights, and it's a strategic vantage point that overlooks Lebanon and Israeli troop positions, and of course has a lot of water. People forget that the Golan Heights have oil, gas, water, and the Israelis, you saw them, Chris, they're on Twitter openly celebrating that they're going to build ski resorts. Enough of them. It's so disgusting. But if we say anything, apparently that makes us anti-Semitic, and we're violating their rights.
Crazy. Well, we have to resist that absolute nonsense, don't we? But just before I bring Piers back in for any concluding remarks and any comments you might want to make about what you've been saying, this looks to me like the Greater Israel project writ large, isn't it? Is this well, just say a bit about that, Richard.
Exactly. This is what it's all about, and so that's what Smotrich was referring to when he said he wants to expand it to Damascus, and they won't stop there. And all the people who stand idly by are gonna, they're gonna have a rude awakening, unfortunately, when they find that Israeli troops are in Iraq and in Saudi Arabia and back in Egypt. This is not going to stop. And even if you look at their map of Greater Israel, it leaves out everything that's east of the Euphrates, which is what the Americans and Kurds occupy, which is kind of ironic because if you think about it, the United States occupying that region means that it really is included now, isn't it? So it's in some parts it's gone even beyond what they were dreaming of. Israeli soldiers walk around in Gaza and now inside of Syria with patches of Greater Israel on their shoulders, on their arms, and they make no effort to hide what their intentions are.
Absolutely.
Expect that it's a colony founded on land grabs, and what they're doing in Syria is another land grab in addition to a tactical, if not a strategic, victory.
Yes, indeed. Something that should really concentrate the minds of those who, in the Muslim community and in the kind of liberal left who, have been celebrating the events over the last few days and the downfall of Bashar al-Assad. But let me bring Piers back on for the last 5 or 6 minutes as well, and perhaps keep Richard on screen as well if we can. Is any thoughts on Richard's contribution this evening? Anything you would like to add to what Richard's been saying?
Well, I agree extensively with what Richard's saying, and I feel very sorry for you and for what's happened to your country, effectively. I mean, it's interesting listening to this conversation we were having about propaganda before. Is testimony to the power of all the propaganda that there's been on Western audiences, that we're all sitting there feeling that we need to challenge this idea that is being pumped out, that we're liberating this country. We're not. This is a regime change, in inverted commas, operation. Same as Iraq, same as Afghanistan, same as Libya. It's happened again and again. These are very deliberate wars initiated, fueled in order to pursue Western interests. We've known this for anyone who looks at the PNAC documents, looks at the Chilcot inquiry, listens to Wesley Clark talking about 7 countries in 5 years. This is Western power politics. It's nothing about liberation. It's nothing about saving people. It's about destroying countries to serve our interests. It highlights I think the depravity of Western foreign policy. But we're battling against this propaganda, so we feel we feel a bit cautious sometimes about saying that. No, these are just wars. They're illegal. Our political classes should be put on trial for what's been done over the last 20 years. The other point, I mean, you were trying to think about sort of the question of what was Russia's motivation in all of this. I mean, I keep on coming back to this kind of sense that this is geopolitics we have going on at the moment. We have big shifts in the international system. The Western Empire clearly isn't dead yet, but but there's shifts in the distribution of power globally, and there's and foreign policy elites see these things as chessboards. Okay, so you could conceive of Russia doing a deal over the Ukraine and Syria. You could also see this in terms of spheres of influence starting to emerge, as we had during the Cold War, right? And you had conflict often at the margins of those spheres and so on. But you have that kind of tectonic shift in the geopolitical structure, and you have these conflicts, and maybe this is and with Israel there pushing and taking going for the Greater Israel Project and so on, Russia pulling back, maybe drawing a line at Iran, and then seeing if things are going to settle there for a period of time. And I suspect we might be seeing that. The final thing, and we talked about misdirection in Israel and what's going on in Israel, and about how just shocking it is that we are living through a genocide. And you and I, when we were at school, Chris, and I'm sure Richard as well, you always taught never again and so on. This is what we set up the United Nations, and here we are again doing this. And clearly Israel, the Israeli or the Zionist project is, of course, they're cheering at the moment. They're sending the tanks into Syria, as Richard described. It's very difficult, but I have a crystal ball, but ultimately, and we're in a kind of a shock and awe campaign, right? Especially with events over the last year and the genocide, and then with what we're seeing in Lebanon and Syria. And people are a little bit dazed and confused. I'd be surprised if this is ultimately in the long run going to play in the interests of the Zionists and of the Israeli state. The genocide is so blatant. The awareness of this is so globally, everyone else outside the Western bubble sees what is happening. I don't think it's going to play well in the interests in the long term or even the medium term for Israel. They're going to win this. They have the power, etc., and they're to take sections of Israel of Syria. But I'd say just wait.
No, indeed.
Because we're seeing I guess people dying.
Absolutely. I mean, my message, I guess, would be to viewers is, it is a depressing time, those who are concerned about these matters, but, we have to keep hope alive. And just on the point about, propaganda, there's been a massive propaganda effort for decades and decades in support of Israel. Well, they've lost the battle of public opinion over Palestine. And while some people have been hoodwinked into thinking the regime change taking place in Syria is a good thing. A lot of people don't think that, but some people do. I think they will already getting a rude awakening. And so in spite of, the best endeavors of the powers that be, public opinion around the world is overwhelmingly on the side of right. And, quote I often use from Martin Luther King about the arc of the moral universe is long, but in the end it bends towards justice. And, what we've got to do is try and use our best endeavours to ensure that arc does bend towards justice sooner rather than later. But guys, we are out of time now. I want to really thank you very much indeed for participating. And just a bit of news hot off the press. I'm absolutely delighted to say that Richard Medhurst has agreed to be a regular host now of No2Nato. And so viewers will be seeing Richard a little bit more, taking the role that I've taken tonight in chairing meetings. Obviously, he's got a wide experience and obviously has a lot of important things to say. And I would also plead for the fundraising exercise that we're engaged in now. We're trying to, build support for No2Nato. We've got a financial appeal going now. We're trying to raise funds to be able to appoint a full-time organizer for No2Nato. It's absolutely crucial, I think, that we have those resources, that strength in depth, really, to build this movement, because it is crucially important. We are hurtling towards World War III. We've seen, obviously, we've been speaking about what's happening in Syria tonight, but obviously what's happening over in Ukraine and indeed around the world. The growth of NATO is a threat to international peace and order, and I think more that we can alert people to that fact and raise consciousness and raise awareness, that will hopefully enable us to in the end win the day, because in these countries that allegedly have democracies, we can get people like candidates for the Workers' Party, who are anti-imperialist candidates and do want to bring about peace and justice in the world, and not just continually support the military industrial complex. But thanks everybody for watching. Any final I see you still on the screen, Rich, any final words about becoming a regular host on No2Nato?
Well, I think it's about time, and I'm more than happy to help. And just like you said, we can see what NATO's been doing for the last couple of years and what it's doing right now in Ukraine, in Syria, and the direction that we're headed in. And we need to build this movement and make it larger. I mean, again, we're not in the Cold War anymore. There's no need for NATO. The Warsaw Pact is gone. NATO's an offensive alliance. We've got to get rid of it, and especially when it's a literal threat to world peace. It doesn't benefit anyone. So I look forward to hosting these, and hope I can do as good of a job as you. And
I'm sure you'll do a far better job, Richard, and we look forward to seeing you on screen. But thanks very much indeed to Richard Medhurst, and of course to Piers Robinson this evening. I think it's been a really good discussion. Two fantastic guests with incredible amounts of knowledge to impart. And thank you everybody for watching this evening. No2Nato will be back soon, and we look forward to seeing you when we are back on screen. So thanks a lot and good night.